The wind, a restless spirit, scoured the canyon, whispering tales of grit and bone into the ears of the lone rider. Elias guided his horse, Dust, along the lip of the arroyo, the late afternoon sun bleeding crimson across the western mesas. His face, weathered as the sandstone cliffs, was a map of unspoken sorrows and hard-won resilience. He moved with the land, a part of its stoic silence, his thoughts as sparse and deliberate as his words. For a week, an unease had settled in his gut, a subtle discord in the vast, unforgiving harmony he usually found in this solitude. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the circling of a hawk, it was something less defined, a tremor in the soul of the desert itself. He stopped, Dust snorting softly, sensing the shift in his rider. Elias scanned the broken land below, his eyes, the color of faded denim, missing nothing. A shimmer of movement, unnatural against the ochre. Too small for a deer, too low for a bird. He dismounted, his worn leather chaps creaking a familiar song, and tethered Dust to a skeletal juniper. The air grew heavy, pregnant with a silence that was not peace, but a held breath. He moved down the loose scree, his steps sure, his hand resting near the colt at his hip, a habit ingrained by years of solitude and the ghosts of memory. The scent hit him first, faint but undeniable, the sour tang of neglect, of life clinging precariously to its frayed thread. Then, a sound, a dry, rasping cough, quickly stifled. He pushed aside a curtain of brittle desert broom. There, huddled in the shallow cleft of a rock, were two children. A boy and a girl, no older than 7 or 8, their clothes little more than rags clinging to skeletal frames. Dust caked their hair and faces, making them seem like small, forgotten statues molded from the earth itself. The boy lay curled, his breath shallow, a tremor running through him that had nothing to do with the evening chill. The girl sat bolt upright, a fierce, protective thing, her eyes, too large for her gaunt face, fixed on Elias. They were eyes that had seen too much, endured too much, eyes that were now too tired to plead, holding only a brittle defense. Elias's heart, a muscle he thought long hardened to stone, clenched. He slowly unslung his canteen and a small, greasy sack from his belt. He'd planned a meager meal for himself, a strip of dried venison, hardtack. He pulled out the jerky. The girl's gaze, sharp as flint, darted to the meat, then to his face, then back to the jerky. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper, rough as sand. "Is that for the dogs?" Elias froze. The question, so devoid of hope, so steeped in a lifetime of expecting the worst, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had no dog with him, not for years. He looked at the venison in his hand, then at the child. The setting sun cast long, somber shadows, turning the rock cleft into a deeper wound in the earth. He thought of another child, another pair of eyes, long ago lost to the unforgiving calculus of this land. He knelt slowly, his movements measured, unthreatening. "No," he said, his own voice sounding distant, rusty from disuse. "No, child. This is for you." He broke the jerky into smaller pieces, his rough hand surprisingly gentle. He offered a piece to the girl. She stared at it, then at him, suspicion warring with a hunger so profound it was etched into every line of her frail body. He held it steady, his gaze unwavering, meeting hers not with pity but with a quiet understanding. The wind died down, and in the sudden stillness, the only sound was the boy's faint, ragged breathing. Elias knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this encounter was not chance. The desert had offered him a choice, a path away from the well-worn track of his own grief. He could turn away, leave them to a fate already closing in, or he could shoulder a burden he hadn't sought, a burden that might break him, or perhaps, mend something within that he'd long thought irreparable. The girl's small, trembling hand finally reached out, her fingers brushing his. The journey back to Elias's cabin was a slow, arduous passage, a pilgrimage measured in the shallow breaths of the boy and the watchful silence of the girl. Elias had fashioned a makeshift traver from fallen branches and his spare blanket, carefully lifting the boy, light as a bundle of dry kindling, onto it. Dust, his placid gelding, accepted the new, unsteady burden with his usual stoicism, his hooves picking a careful path through the moon-drenched landscape. The girl walked beside Elias, her small hand clutching a fold of his worn duster, a silent anchor in the overwhelming darkness. She never spoke, but her eyes, when they caught the moonlight, were like chips of obsidian, reflecting the vast, indifferent stars and the unreadable terrain of her own young, ravaged heart. Elias said little, understanding that words were a currency these children had likely learned to distrust. Instead, he offered the steady rhythm of his presence, the quiet assurance of his strength. He pointed out the distant howl of a wolf, not as a threat, but as another voice in the night's choir. He showed her the pale luminescence of a cactus flower unfurling in the cool air, a small, defiant spark of beauty in the harshness. He felt the weight of their unspoken history, a palpable thing that clung to them like the desert dust. He wondered what horrors had driven them to this desolate edge, what wolves in human form had pursued them until their small bodies had nearly given out. The questions hung in the air, unanswered, but he did not press. He knew trauma had its own timetable, its own language of silence and shadow. His cabin, when they finally reached it in the bruised light before dawn, was little more than a sturdy shelter against the elements, built of rough-hewn timber and chinked with mud. Smoke curled thinly from the stone chimney, a beacon of reluctant welcome. Inside, a fire still glowed in the hearth, a small ember he had banked before leaving, a testament to his methodical, solitary existence. The single room was sparse, furnished with a narrow cot, a rough table, 2 chairs, and shelves holding meager supplies. A worn saddle lay in one corner, its leather smelling of horse and distance. On a small, crudely carved shelf above the hearth sat a single, smooth river stone, and beside it, a faded blue ribbon, its silk frayed at the edges. He settled the boy on his own cot, the only soft place in the cabin, covering him with a thick wool blanket. The child's fevered skin was hot to the touch, his breathing still too quick, too shallow. Elias moved with an economy born of long practice, stoking the fire, heating water. He gently bathed the boy's face with a damp cloth, his large, calloused hands surprisingly tender. The girl watched every move, perched on one of the straight-backed chairs, her small body taut as a bowstring. He offered her a tin cup of warm broth, made from a piece of the venison simmered with a few wild herbs. She took it, her eyes never leaving his, sipping slowly, cautiously. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the boy's labored breaths. Elias felt the familiar ache of his own past stir within him, a phantom limb of grief. The blue ribbon on the shelf seemed to shimmer in the firelight. He remembered another small hand, another fever, another desperate vigil under a similar, indifferent sky. He pushed the memories down, focusing on the immediate. These children needed him. Now. Later, when the boy's breathing had eased slightly and the girl's eyelids had begun to droop with an exhaustion that finally overmastered her fear, Elias sat by the fire, the weight of the night settling upon him. He looked at the 2 small, vulnerable forms, refugees from a world that had shown them no mercy. He had lived so long with ghosts, now, flesh and blood had stumbled into his solitude, demanding not solace for his past, but action in the present. The wind outside picked up, rattling the wooden shutters, a mournful sigh across the vast, empty land. But inside the cabin, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the silence felt less like emptiness, and more like a fragile, nascent peace. He knew this was only the beginning. The desert held many dangers, and the ones these children fled might not be content to let them disappear. He ran a hand over his tired face. The dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in hues of hope and trepidation. He had offered shelter, a moment's respite. What came next, he could not yet see, but a resolve, hard and clear as desert quartz, was forming within him. He would not let the darkness reclaim them without a fight. Days bled into a quiet routine, a rhythm of shared silences and small, tentative gestures. Elias named the children in his own mind, for they offered no names of their own. The boy, pale and still weak, he called Phelan, an old word for a little wolf, for the wild resilience he sensed beneath the frailty. The girl, with her watchful eyes and fierce spirit, he named Sorka, meaning brightness, a hope he held for her future, a light he wished to see rekindled in her gaze. Phelan's fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving him depleted but lucid. He would follow Elias with his eyes, a silent, questioning gaze, but offered no words. Sorka remained the more vocal, though her contributions were sparse, observations rather than conversations. The water bucket is low, she might state, or the fire needs wood. Elias would nod, accepting these pronouncements as the fragile beginnings of trust. He taught them without lecturing, his actions his primary language. He showed Sokka how to grind the parched corn for meal, the circular motion of the stone in the mortar a meditative act. He let Phelan hold a smooth piece of cartonwood while he carved, the shavings falling like soft snow, slowly transforming the wood into the rough shape of a bird. He noticed the way Sokka would flinch if he moved too quickly, the way Phelan would sometimes cry out in his sleep, small, muffled sounds of terror. He saw the faint, faded brand on the boy's wrist when his sleeve slipped, a cruel mark like a cattle brand, quickly hidden. He did not ask. He simply made sure the cabin door was barred at night and kept his rifle close, its polished barrel a dull gleam in the firelight. He found himself speaking more than he had in years, not in long discourses, but in small offerings. He told them the names of the desert plants, the ones that healed and the ones that warned. He spoke of the constellations that wheeled across the night sky, ancient patterns that had guided travelers for millennia. He did not speak of his wife, Sarah, or their daughter, Lily, whose laughter had once filled a cabin much like this one, before the sickness came like a thief in the night. But their presence was there, in the faded blue ribbon, in the small, carefully tended patch of wildflowers he cultivated near the door, Lily's favorites. One afternoon, as a storm gathered, darkening the sky and bringing a cool, damp wind, Sokka stood by the small, greased paper window, watching the rain begin to fall. "It washes things clean," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Elias, mending a stirrup leather, looked up. "Sometimes," he agreed. "And sometimes it just moves the dust around." She turned, her eyes holding a depth of understanding that belied her years. "Our ma used to say tears were like rain for the heart." He nodded slowly, the leather still in his hands. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." A flicker of something, pain, memory, perhaps even a ghost of a smile, crossed Sokka's face before vanishing. "They took her," she said, so softly he almost didn't hear it over the drumming rain. "And Pa. For the debt." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. The debt. The brand on Phelan's wrist. Pieces of a grim puzzle began to fall into place. Indenture, or something worse. A life owed to a cruel master. He felt a cold anger rise within him, an old, familiar fire he thought had long turned to ash. He set the leather aside. He walked to the window, stood beside Sokka. The rain was coming down in sheets now, blurring the landscape, turning the world outside into a grey, weeping canvas. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. It was the first time he had initiated touch beyond the necessities of care, and the first time she had accepted it without recoiling. A small, almost imperceptible shift, but in the fragile ecosystem of their evolving connection, it felt momentous. Phelan, sitting by the hearth, coughed, a dry, small sound. He was sketching in the dirt floor with a charred stick, his lines hesitant but focused. Elias looked at the two children, these small, battered souls entrusted to his care by a capricious fate. The storm outside raged, but within the cabin, a quiet resolve was hardening within him. He was no longer just a man hiding from his ghosts. He was a guardian. And he would guard them with every fiber of his being. The dust, he thought, was far from settled. The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and the desert smelling of creosote and damp earth. A fragile peace settled over the small cabin, a peace Elias knew was as precarious as a spider's web in a gale. He saw subtle changes in the children. Phelan began to venture small, hesitant smiles, especially when Elias praised his crude drawings in the dirt. Sokka's shoulders seemed less hunched, her gaze less haunted, though her vigilance remained. She started asking questions, not just about survival, but about Elias. "Were you always alone?" she asked one evening, as he cleaned his rifle by the firelight. He paused, the oiled rag still in his hand. "Not always," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't elaborate, but the answer, and the way he said it, seemed to satisfy her curiosity for the moment. He knew they were being watched. Not by wolves or coyotes, but by something far more calculating. Twice, he'd found fresh horse tracks too close to the cabin, deliberately obscured but not quite well enough for a man who knew the land as intimately as he did. He recognized the pattern of a shod cavalry horse, disciplined, purposeful. He doubled his patrols, his senses heightened, every shadow a potential threat, every gust of wind a possible whisper of approaching danger. The inevitable arrived on a sun-drenched morning, the kind of morning that mocked the idea of peril. Elias was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort, when Phelan, who had been trying to coax a lizard onto a stick, let out a small, sharp cry of fear. Elias straightened, axe still in hand. 3 riders were approaching, not from the main trail, but cutting across the open scrub, their pace unhurried, arrogant. The man in the lead was tall, dressed in a dark, formal coat that looked out of place in the rugged terrain. A silver star glinted on his chest. Marshal Thorne. Elias had heard the name whispered in hushed tones in the few settlements he'd visited over the years, a man who enforced the company's law with an iron fist, a man who saw people as assets or liabilities. Thorne reined in his horse a respectful distance from Elias, his eyes, cold as winter river ice, taking in the cabin, the neatly stacked firewood, Elias himself. His companions, rough-looking men with mean eyes, flanked him, their hands resting near their holstered guns. "Quite the homestead you've got here, mister," Thorne said, his voice smooth, almost pleasant, but with an underlying edge of steel. "A bit remote for my tastes." Elias said nothing, his gaze steady, the axe held loosely at his side. He could feel Sorka's eyes on him from the cabin window. "We're looking for runaways," Thorne continued, his gaze flicking towards the cabin. 2 children. A boy and a girl. Property of the Consolidated Mining and Agricultural Concern. Absconded from the Redemption Camp up north. You wouldn't have seen them, would you? Redemption Camp. Elias knew it by its darker, more honest name, the Debt Pits. Where families were swallowed whole, their lives forfeit to faceless corporations for generations. The brand on Phelan's wrist burned in his mind's eye. "Children?" Elias said, his voice deliberately flat. "This is hard country for children to be wandering alone." Thorne's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "They're resilient. And they belong to the concern. There's a hefty finder's fee." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. "Or a charge of harboring fugitives, for those less cooperative." The threat was clear, wrapped in the veneer of legality. Elias shifted his weight slightly. The sun beat down, the silence stretched, taut and vibrating. He thought of Sarah, of Lily. He thought of the desperate hope in Sorka's voice when she spoke of her mother, the terror in Phelan's sleeping cries. "This land," Elias said slowly, his voice raspy but firm, "doesn't care much for papers or claims made by men in offices far away. It offers shelter to those who need it." Thorne's smile faded. "Is that a no, old man?" One of his men chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "I reckon he's gone soft in the head." Marshal Elias ignored him, his eyes locked on Thorne. "These children you speak of, if they were here, they'd be under my protection." Thorne's hand moved almost imperceptibly towards his own sidearm. "Protection is a strong word. Are you prepared to back it up?" The air crackled with unspoken violence. Dust, sensing the tension, whinnied softly from the small corral. Sorka's face, pale and determined, was a small blur at the window. Phelan was nowhere to be seen, likely hidden. Elias's grip tightened on the axe handle. He was one man, past his prime, against 3. But he was not just defending a piece of land, or 2 nameless children. He was defending the last vestiges of his own humanity, the fragile hope for redemption that these children had unknowingly brought to his door. "I am," Elias said, his voice echoing with a conviction that surprised even himself. The wind picked up, swirling dust around them, a gritty veil between the antagonists. The standoff was joined. The desert held its breath. Marshal Thorne's eyes narrowed, glittering with a cold, predatory light. He had expected fear, or perhaps a clumsy attempt at negotiation from a cornered old man. This quiet, unyielding defiance was an unwelcome complication. "You're making a mistake, friend," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr. A costly one. Elias stood his ground, the axe still held loosely, not as a weapon of immediate aggression, but as a clear statement of intent. He was a rock, weathered and worn, but unmovable. "The only mistake," Elias replied, his voice level, "was thinking you could ride in here and claim human souls like stray cattle." One of Thorn's men, impatient and spoiling for a fight, shifted in his saddle. "Let's just take Marshall." His one old goat. Thorn raised a hand, silencing his subordinate. He was a man who preferred the illusion of law, the veneer of authority, over blatant thuggery, when possible. It was cleaner, more efficient. But Elias was not cooperating. "These children are fugitives from a legal indenture contract," Thorn stated, his tone hardening. "They are assets of the concern. I have a warrant for their return." He reached into his coat, producing a folded document. "This paper says they belong to me, or rather, to my employers." Elias's gaze didn't waver. "That paper was written with ink stolen from the veins of families like theirs. It holds no power here. Not with me." From the cabin, a small sound. Sorka had opened the door a crack, her face pale but resolute. In her hand, she clutched the small wooden bird Elias had carved for Phelan. It was a fragile shield, but a shield nonetheless. Thorn's eyes flickered towards her, a predatory gleam. "So, they are here." She almost smiled. "Stubbornness will only make this harder on them, and on you." "Leave them be, Thorn," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "Ride out. Find your profits elsewhere." Thorn's patience, thin as desert ice, finally snapped. "Enough of this. Men, retrieve the assets." The two henchmen began to dismount, their movements eager, brutal. Elias knew this was the moment. He could not win a gunfight against three. But he didn't need to. He needed to make the cost too high, the effort too public, too messy for Thorn's calculated cruelty. He took one step forward, planting himself directly between the approaching men and the cabin door. "You'll have to come through me." His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of an unshakable conviction. The first man, a burly figure with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, lunged. Elias didn't try to meet force with force. He sidestepped, the years of solitary life making him quicker, more agile than his appearance suggested. He brought the flat of the axe head up, not to cleave, but to block, to deflect. The impact jarred his arm, but the man stumbled, surprised by the old man's unexpected strength and speed. The second man drew his pistol. "Don't be a fool, old-timer." Before he could aim, a small, dirt-caked hand shot out from behind Elias. Phelan, small and fierce as his namesake, threw a handful of fine dust directly into the gunman's eyes. The man roared, clutching his face, his shot going wild, splintering the top rail of the corral fence. Thorn, enraged, drew his own weapon. "Damn you all!" He aimed at Elias. But in that instant, Sorka screamed, a high, piercing cry of pure, unadulterated fury and fear. It wasn't a scream of surrender, but of defiance. And it carried. It carried across the still morning air, echoing off the distant mesas. From the rise beyond Elias's cabin, where the trail wound down from the higher passes, a new figure appeared. Another rider. Then another. Settlers, a small family heading west, drawn by the gunshot and the scream. They paused, taking in the scene, the armed marshal, his flustered men, the determined old man, the two terrified children. Thorn froze. His authority depended on an unquestioned narrative of order. This chaotic scene, with witnesses, undermined that. He was a company man, not a common outlaw, and the appearance of uninvolved onlookers complicated his mission immeasurably. He lowered his pistol, his face a mask of cold fury. "This isn't over, old man," he snarled, his voice tight with suppressed rage. He looked at the children with a chilling promise in his eyes. "The concern always collects its debts." He gestured sharply to his men. The one blinded by dust was still cursing, the other sheepishly remounting. Thorn gave Elias one last, venomous glare, then wheeled his horse and rode away, his henchmen scrambling to follow, a retreat more than a departure. Elias watched them go, his body trembling with adrenaline, the axe heavy in his hand. He slowly lowered it. The desert air, moments before thick with violence, seemed to sigh in relief. Phelan and Sorka rushed to his side, their small hands clutching his trousers. He put his arms around them, a clumsy, unpracticed embrace, but one filled with a fierce, protective warmth. The settler family began to approach cautiously. The father, a lean man with kind eyes, tipped his hat. "Everything all right here, mister?" Elias looked at the two children pressed against him, their faces buried in his sides. He looked at the retreating dust cloud of Thorne's posse. He looked at the vast, indifferent sky, which suddenly felt a little less empty. "Yes," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. "I believe it is." For now the sun climbed higher, flooding the small clearing with light. A new day had dawned, hard won and fragile, but a new day nonetheless. He had faced down the embodiment of cruelty, not with bullets, but with a stubborn refusal to yield. He had protected these children, and in doing so, had perhaps begun to protect the wounded parts of his own soul. The path ahead was uncertain, the threat of Thorne's return a lingering shadow. But for this moment, they were safe. For this moment, they were together. And in the quiet understanding that passed between them, unspoken but profound, the faint outline of a new kind of family began to take shape, etched not in blood, but in shared hardship, courage, and a love as resilient as the desert wildflowers that pushed their way through stone. And so, Elias, the man who had sought solace in solitude, found his world irrevocably altered by the arrival of two starving children and the echo of a desperate question. He had faced down the shadows of his past and the tangible threats of the present, choosing compassion over indifference, courage over fear. The cabin, once a monument to his loneliness, now resonated with the quiet hum of nascent hope, the soft footfalls of children learning to trust again, the tentative whispers of stories shared by the hearth's warm glow. The blue ribbon on the mantelpiece no longer seemed solely a token of loss, but a reminder of the enduring power of love, a thread connecting past grief with future possibility. Phelan's drawings in the dirt became more confident, filled with depictions of birds in flight and a cabin wreathed in protective sunlight. Sorka's eyes, though still holding the wisdom of one who has seen too much, began to reflect the light, sometimes even sparkling with a fleeting, childlike curiosity. She started to mend their clothes with a needle Elias found in an old tin, her small stitches surprisingly neat, binding together the tattered remnants of their old lives with the stronger fabric of their new one. The pair of worn boots Elias had given Phelan, too large but fiercely treasured, became a symbol of their journey, of steps taken away from despair and towards an unknown, yet hopeful, horizon. Elias never asked about the specifics of the redemption camp, nor did the children offer more than the fragmented memories that sometimes surfaced in hushed tones or troubled sleep. He understood that some wounds needed silence to heal, that some stories were too heavy to be fully spoken. Instead, he offered the steady rhythm of his presence, the quiet strength of his protection, and the unspoken promise that they were no longer alone. Marshal Thorne and the shadow of the concern did not simply vanish, but their immediate threat receded, pushed back by the unwavering resolve of one man and the unexpected courage of two children. The vast desert, once a landscape of Elias's solitary grief, now seemed to hold a different kind of immensity, the boundless potential for healing, for connection, for the forging of new bonds in the crucible of shared experience. The wind still whispered through the canyons, but now its voice seemed to carry not just tales of hardship, but also melodies of resilience, of the enduring human spirit's capacity to find light even in the deepest darkness. The simple gifts exchanged, a carved bird, a shared meal, a moment of quiet understanding, became talismans against the encroaching shadows, affirmations of a found family, unexpected and fiercely cherished. What will you do when faced with the choice to protect the vulnerable, even at great personal cost? Will you turn away, or will you stand as a guardian, offering shelter against the storm? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please subscribe and click the bell for more tales of courage and connection. What does true justice look like when pitted against the weight of systemic cruelty? Join the conversation, and perhaps we can find the answer together.